Welcome to Invented Futures. I'll quickly outline what is the point, why are we here, why are we talking about this, who are we, and what questions we'll answer. So I'm Maria. I run Invented Futures, which is a research collective that prioritizes design fiction and speculative thinking as frameworks for understanding the social cultural impact of emerging tech. We ask, how can we begin to uncover possible worlds and technological futures that reflect a vast range of imaginations? So the point of this evening is to uncover the role of speculation in shaping or reshaping our cultural understanding of the future. When we think of the future, we usually think of it as a space that we will reach at some point, a predefined place we're heading towards. And this future arrives with images and contexts pre-constructed by tech corporations, powerful individuals, the media, films, fiction. Paraphrase, done a movie and speculative, everything. The future exists insofar as we can imagine it. And so if we're going to open the future up to its ability, we need new imaginaries. And there are always alternatives, even if one imaginary does dominate. We're all familiar with the future of the holodeck, of the next iteration of the iPhone, but there are always other ways of imagining, relating, and worlding. Whether it's, George Clinton on a stage, the sounds of Detroit techno, William Morris's utopian writing, Octavia Butler's speculative world, or even just daydreaming. Speculation can make more imaginative demands on the future. I am joined by Mali Lujan Escalante, lecturer in design-led innovation at Bristol University, and Susan Halford, professor in sociology and co-director of the Bristol Digital Futures Institute. Perhaps we'll have Edson Burton, writer and performer, curator and historian. We'll see. To look at how speculation can create more inventive demands on the future or futures. And if we say the word future enough times, if we shout loud enough, it might start to exist. So this evening, we're focusing on speculation. And the structure of the conversation will go like this. What is the future? What is speculation? Why do some people create and write things in a speculative way? And how can these ideas be used to speculate more about how society might live alongside technology? We'll have a bit of a Q&A perhaps, and then that's it. So perhaps we'll start with more in-depth introductions. If you'd like to introduce yourselves in any way you see fit. Male, would you like to go first?
Yeah, my name is Male. I'm a lecturer at the Center for Innovation. I do work in the area of responsible research innovation, not just as an educator and as a researcher, but I work with tech industry in the area of communications in the domain of emergency response, doing responsible work. I engage with the idea of futures and speculations because in my domain, we work around a very big what if. So around this area is always thinking about the future. And sometimes in the emergency domain are really, really fast futures, really, really critical futures. This is my favorite conversation to have. And I just wanted to express to Susan how happy I am to be part of this conversation and to Maria for inviting me. But also, I am sitting around the table of my kitchen with my teen son and my husband very near to me. And I'm saying this not just to embarrassing them, but also to be true to my position where I'm talking tonight. And also because I'm really against this idea of working from home. I think we have to start normalizing that we're bringing work to home. And sometimes it's a very uninvited guest. But tonight is we are very welcoming guys and all the festival and all the audience, 80 people in the chat. So this is great. But I wanted to thank my family to co-host you and for you to be part of our normal Wednesday night conversation after dinner.
Cool. I really like the introduction. And Susan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Well, likewise, it's a real pleasure to be here and to meet people from my own university who I haven't met before. So that's always a brilliant outcome, but also to meet Edson, hello. And,
Hi.
And Maria.
You're on, Edson.
I know, but I think I may have.
I think you are on.
No, I'm on, but I think I had two versions running at the same time. So
okay.
I'm now on in a easier way to be listened and heard. To be heard and seen even.
I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you made it, even with the two versions of the link. We're just introducing ourselves. So we'll go back to Susan.
I'll carry on, shall I? But nice to meet you.
Sorry, Susan.
Look forward to learning more. So I'm Susan Lockwood. I'm a sociologist, I suppose. I have spent all of my life as an academic researcher working with other disciplines, never only with sociologists. All of my research these days is with engineers. Spent 15 years working with computer scientists. I suppose my primary area of research interest is in politics of digital data and infrastructures. And as a sociologist, I've concentrated very much for a large part of all of that time on the past and present. And over the last, I suppose, 4, 5, 6 years, it's become very, very clear to me that sociology needs to engage much more directly and actively in thinking about futures and recognizing actually that there are a lot of resources that we have as sociologists and as researchers that we can bring to bear on thinking about and creating futures, but that we need to get very actively engaged. And as part of that, I'm co-director of something called the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, which is right across the University of Bristol, but also we work with 27 external partners ranging from large corporate organisations like big industry and big telecommunications companies, but also with government and also with community groups in Bristol and beyond. So the aim of Digital Futures is to really open up and broaden out that prospective, forward-facing activity in thinking about the kinds of digital futures that we're creating, not only in a speculative way, although I hope we're going to have a conversation about the relationship between, past, present and future and how they shape each other, and the relationship between imagination and speculation and practice and materiality, because that's something that I'm really, really interested in and think is really important. And just on a personal note, we're all used to speaking into the void on these conferences, but it's still quite weird, isn't it?
It's definitely still quite strange. We're still staying with the strangeness. That's why we're trying to make it as sort of familiar and informal as not possible, but as suits us. So Edson, I've asked people to introduce themselves in a way that they see fit.
So I'm a writer, historian, curator, based in Bristol, have been in Bristol since 1994. And, oh gosh, I guess there isn't one theme which occupies my work. And I know that when we spoke, Maria, you were interested in my sort of Afrofuturist take on things. But I think that participates more in a discussion that, no.
Oh no.
I think he'll be back.
I think he will be back, but okay. Cool. I'm not quite sure what's happened, but if we just assume Edson will be back, we can welcome him when that occurs. Shall we start? So each of you I've got certain questions, but I guess they are sort of pointed at everyone. But I will kind of prompt you if I do sort of want your take on the question. So a quick reiteration, we're going to think about what the future is, what speculation is, how speculation has been used to create imaginative demands on the future through fiction, theatre, music, and subcultures, and how can these ideas be used to speculate more about how society, how we might live alongside technology in the future. I think we should start broadly. So in order to grasp what is and what isn't possible and why that matters, we need to ask, what is the future? And as I mentioned in the intro, there is a cultural understanding of the future that doesn't quite seem so inevitable now, and which in any case is fed to us through films, through the latest phone, and through personal desires that become the status quo. So Male, would you like to sort of outline what the future is to you?
My visions of the futures are entangled with my visions of the past and my visions of the present. So I really identified with what Susan was saying about past, present, and futures. I actually teach a unit at a university that is called Past, Present, and Futures. So my view is that the same creative space or the same capabilities that you use to connect with memories or to connect with past is about where we need to be to connect with futures. But inevitable, these futures are happening now or are fictional, but not in fictional way where they don't matter or they are secondary, but in a way that they are generated in the now. So these imaginaries, these films that you mentioned, and this playfulness that comes when we're thinking about the futures, come in the rehearsing of those now, entangled with the past. And my other important point that I try to make always is that this is not happening in a continuing line of moments, points, but actually in a three-dimensional structure, dynamic structure of the now, in where past and futures fold into each other, not necessarily in line, but in a fragmental, discontinuum, quantum ways. So I'm sorry if I already went too deep, but but this is what I'm trying to think. And I actually think it's a very productive way to start thinking about it with my students or with when I do training or stuff like that.
No, I think going deep first is the only way to talk about this stuff. So you're sort of saying the future is culture dependent and entangled in how we make sense of now. Susan, what would sociologists' view be on all of this? How do you think about a sociology of the future? Is it in relation to social theory, or is it one that really grounds itself in like constructs, just like, you know, the self, the social world, time?
Well, it's not either or, it's both. And I very much actually recognise Male's description just now, and would probably end up in the same place, but let's come at it from a slightly different direction, perhaps. So, the future is quite troubling for sociologists because we know that the future is complex and we know that the future is contingent. So the future tends to surprise us. And it tends to surprise us both empirically, things happen in the world that we don't expect to happen, and it tends to surprise us theoretically as well. And sociology has quite an undistinguished history in terms of making big sweeping claims about futures that have turned out to be spectacularly wrong. So if you think of the big founding fathers, and I do mean fathers of sociology, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, they all spoke about the future. They all had faith that they were able to say something about the future. And actually that turned out really to be really quite wrong in a number of fundamental ways. So I think what we've learned from that kind of 100 years or so of modernist sociology is two key things. And I think these really echo what Male said. So the first one is, there is no linear path to the future to be discovered. That there isn't a sociology of the future in that sense, in that the future doesn't exist yet, and it is not out there waiting to be discovered. If only we could find the right tools to discover it. We have to get rid of that idea, number one. And secondly, that future's foretold, the way we think about the future is always told from somewhere. You know, just like knowledge comes from somewhere, there is not abstract truth, you know, in that sense, but that futures come from a position, they come from a perspective, they come from a place, they come from a past and a present that shapes the ways in which futures are foretold. And that's really, really important. So the future is not empty, but nor is the future fixed. And I think that is not, I'll just finish on this point. That may sound like a very negative thing, to say that we can't know the future. Actually, I think it's an incredibly positive thing, because we're not waiting for the future to happen to us. We're making the future in the present. And for me as a sociologist, the important thing is to understand how futures are made in the present, what the path dependencies are, because there are some things with us now that will be with us for a very, very long time. And if we think about climate crisis, for example, you know, some of the creation of the climate crisis has come with things that have been present in the world for hundreds of years. Yes, we might be able to change them in some ways, but they're still present. So it's about understanding path dependencies, but it's also about understanding what can be changed. And the fact that the future is not fixed is liberating, because it means that there are things that we can change, even if we have to recognize those path dependencies. So for me, that's kind of where I'm coming from, I suppose.
I will add something, if I can interrupt. I also agree with everything that you said, but for me and for my students, sometimes it's very productive to think about an archaeology of the futures, because maybe what we get is shards or fragments. So the power of creativity of the power is in connecting these fragments into an intelligible constellation, but that doesn't mean that that is going to be the future. However, by rehearsing these constellations, we create in these futures. So I'm more into the archaeologies of the futures.
Yeah, I haven't heard that phrase before. It's a really, really nice phrase, but I agree. This is not about knowing the future. We can't know the future, but we can't abandon the future either. That idea that somehow we just wait for this to happen to us, either because it's inevitable or because we have no control or no agency in this. Both of those things are flawed starting points. The future is alive and present, and we have to engage with it and do it and make it, and recognize that we can't control it.
Exactly.
I'm talking about it, I don't mean it. You know, there are multiple perspective futures, of course.
Yeah, and that's something I really should have said in the introduction, that this is really one conversation of, you know, an infinite amount of conversation. This is just one strand. And so once you open up that initial conversation, you'll just find a box of never-ending ones. So go and have your own conversation about whatever futures you prefer. So we're dealing with something that doesn't exist. And its only real framework, perhaps, is the imagination, or we might say the future is real to the extent that we allow ourselves to imagine it. I think I want to ask Susan, you know, if really, how do we sort of imagine whilst we're sort of imbricated in technology or digital infrastructure? So perhaps if the interface between our imaginations and the world is the digital, it's social media, it's online games, it's Twitter threads, it's streaming. Living together and living with ourselves is about sort of maintaining certain fiction. But sometimes we're doing that maintaining with technology. So how do we form new constructs within this social construction of reality, of communication, if we're really going to try and imagine alternatives?
So two things. I mean, the first thing, I think it's not only about imagination. I think imagination is absolutely central and critical, but I think there is a relationship between the imaginary and the material and the enacted and the already present. So I don't think it's only about imagination, but maybe we can come back to that. Maybe that's controversial in this event. I don't know. I think your second question is kind of how do you think outside the Borg, isn't it? I mean, you're kind of asking a question about, are we so embroiled, so kind of shaped and determined by digital technologies that it's impossible to think beyond it? Is that's kind of your question, I think. What choice do we have, right? We are living in an age where digital technologies are so fundamental to forms of communication, knowledge, identity, expression, whatever. These are part of our lives. We have no choice other than to think through some of those. But I don't know if anyone's familiar with Donna Haraway's work on staying with the trouble. And I think, she has a wonderful way of talking about that, which is it is about there is no choice. And we have to find ways of thinking creatively, constructively, disruptively. There is no technologies don't do one thing. They're multiple, they're contested, they're competing. And I think it's about finding the people, the alliances, and the alliances in terms of experts and people that you can work with who understand and know and can do something different with those digital technologies and devices and understand their contingency and flexibility and possibility. But it's also about disrupting very dominant narratives, that dominant narrative of technological determinism, that technologies do one thing, or they are inevitable, or that they do all, add up to one kind of outcome. And I think one of the ways that's really important of disrupting that is to say this isn't people living alongside technology. It's not like there's technology in one pile of stuff over here and people over here. Like, people make technologies and technologies make people. And they are absolutely embroiled and intertwined and engaged with each other. And that is a way of disrupting that determinism, I think. I might have gone off track at the end there.
I think it's a little unfair for any other argument that may be in the room, because I'm also Team Haraway. So I'm just going to reinforce your point. Yeah, my point was that society and technology are not separate things. So I will call it socio-technology or networks, assemblages, whatever you want to call it. But also, I think it's in the encounter with the difference that we can create different spaces. So this is why this polarization now, politically and in social media, is so dangerous, because it's cutting opportunities to encountering the different. I believe that it's in these catalytic encounters where we can thicken in the line, to cite Haraway again, and make spaces for otherness. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Edson have a lot to say about that, because he's working in other fields.
I think we should sort of try and ground it in something. These ideas are quite, maybe hard to grasp. But Edson, do you want to finish introducing yourself, or would you prefer to?
Yeah, I think I was okay with where I got to before technology let me down. So I've had a couple of days of different things with either my body falling apart or computers. In some ways, I think, to what extent is our technologies a version and a mirror of ourselves and our desire? And in a sense, it's fascinating that we use technologies, but what do we advance them for? If I think of warfare, that we've had sometimes the greatest application of the human mind to killing each other. And I guess the great hope of the online world was that we'd all be reading Shakespeare and so on. In fact, it's a great vehicle for porn. So in some ways, I think it isn't so much technology, but it's more understanding how it heightens and intensifies the struggles that we have, both as this desire-driven creature, also as an enlightenment being, and so on. I guess in some ways, when we look at social media, in some, as one example, the problem partly is understanding what the game is, understanding that, in a sense, those same power games, those same sort of issues of dominance and control are still being played out. It's just that sometimes it's much less visible. I suppose many of us, unless we consume or make media, have little idea of its level of artifice. And so it's, in a sense, I think, that the whole criticality that we established around reading certain kinds of sources also needs to be applied in these new spaces of technological use. So they have, the potentials they have and the limitations they have and the dangers inherent are, I think, also a reflection of what we are as beings. But understanding now that it becomes, in a sense, even more, the stakes are even higher, I think.
Yeah, I think that kind of nicely sort of wrapped up my question to Susan about, how do we form alternatives if we're so imbricated in digital infrastructure, and us, as you said, are a mirror of ourselves. I think I want to get back to speculation. And so how can we get out of, what you've just said, Edwin? How can we get out of that sort of soup of our own desires or only dominant desires? And to some extent, Edson, you've done a lot of creative and critical engagement with this question, like how can you speculate your way out of, dominant structures? So I'd quite like to ask you, how did speculation first become part of your creative practice? What did this kind of speculative thinking about possible futures, how did that grab you?
I guess in some ways, I was always grappling with my absence from literatures that I'd encountered as a young person. So I grew up reading lots of pulp fiction and enjoying all the sword and sandal films that my son will now find incredibly corny. But always feeling slightly disquieted by my absence in them, or that representations of people of African heritage were so other to what I recognized and what I saw. And in a sense, then, that kind of schism, that sense of my invisibility, led me to sort of look for other spaces in which I could imprint myself. But then I think I should say, though, that in some ways I've been as interested in dystopian views as well as the sort of more utopian ideas of the last Blue Song. It's just, of course, you don't always get a chance to play with some of those other ideas. I feel, as well as erasure, I think what I got from my MA and my PhD was the discovery of a whole alternative systems of knowledge that were different from the hegemonic discourses that I had grown up with. Systems of knowledge that were derived from African societies, from indigenous American societies, and so on. Just really incredibly more nuanced and complex ways of looking at the world and how the world functions. And I recognize at the same time that I'm a new being, this child of the diaspora, who fish and chips, rice and peas, all those things, loving Shakespeare, loving Benjamin Zephaniah, Linton Kwesi Johnson. So the sense of some kind of return to Africanness always struck me as problematic. It struck me also too as problematic because I guess I felt that we were so busy, we were so engaged in this kind dichotomy between, in order to dignify this humiliated African psyche, humiliated by colonialism and so on, then you then jump to the other extreme of creating this sort of noble, imaginary, romantic African past. And neither of those really made sense to me in terms of my personal experience of, humanity and also, I guess what one wants to, the imprinting and challenging discourses doesn't, in a sense, mean that we're dealing with the stuff of what it is to be human. And we talked about human desire, but I don't think human desire and the stuff of us, for want of a better word, is the good and the bad. It is our yearning for society, our collective spirit, our better selves and our darker selves. And I use these terms, and I know that they're highly loaded and can be pulled apart. But I think all those tensions are real and they are fundamental to us. So I guess after comic book writing and other stuff, I started to use speculative fiction in two slightly different ways. One as a kind of recovery and a conversation with a past that hasn't really had its light of day. So my Radio 4 character, Deacon, draws upon West African mythologies and places Deacon in Britain. The last blues song was around much more, in a sense, looking at this issue of a what would have been the trajectory of African societies? What would have been the trajectory of really the encounter between Europe and the people that it colonized, had that been on a basis of transactional knowledge? And some transactional knowledge for me implies that, is there a way of exchanging systems of thought, ways of looking at perception and technologies in a way that isn't hegemonic? And I feel that there's been moments in time in our histories where we see flickers of this possibility before they are sort of dissipated. So the last blues song for me was an investigation of what would have been the life or the journey. How do you decolonize? And of course it's impossible, because I'm the subject of a colonized consciousness. So how far could I dream outside of that? But it's to imagine that the characters I create would be so different from me that that they wouldn't recognize my concerns, my interests, and so on.
Could you quickly just reiterate what the last blues song was, or is, or ongoing is, for those who aren't familiar with your writing?
Yeah, so the last blues song came out of a residency that I had at the Pervasive Media Center studio, in 2017. And basically it was I wanted to create oh dear, I don't know where to start, because is it a theatre piece? Is it not a theatre piece? So it began life as the idea of a theatre piece that at its heart was around the notion of an African colony that had set off into space and had deliberately manipulated the story of that colony in such a way that there was no understanding of its history on Earth. So an erasure of slavery and colonialism in order to artificially create a new being, a new consciousness, a new start. And so this colony lands on another planet, and centuries later, with no idea of who they are in the universe, look out at the stars and wonder, is there life out there? And they send their prize ambassador, scientist, explorer, Femi, the Ocherios, off into space, and she follows a signal, and then lands on a planet, and the only surviving being on this planet looks like her, in many ways is hominoid, but is white. And so Femi is for the first time confronted with life on another planet, human life, but also that life looks differently from her. And then gradually, as she begins her investigation, her interaction with Maya, a young Bristol woman, she begins to understand that this is actually the planet of her origin, of the origin of her colony. And then also to begin to also, through elements of ghost power and play, begin to question what happened, or discover what happened to her ancestors and why they left Earth centuries ago. And of course, so it's kind of, what I want to do is kind of flip on its head the whole discovery myth, and to reset that, to imagine, could it be different? But what are the power dynamics that come up when between same and other, and so on?
I think this is a really interesting point to bring in our discussion of what the future is, as well as speculation and how it can be applied creatively, but how it's always coming from this place or underpinned by either political or ethical standpoint to posit altogether separate worlds and to speculate backwards almost. So Marley, could you sort of perhaps talk through speculative futures?
Yeah,
Or the imaginative space of a speculative future, just like Edson's has
yeah, I coincide
grappled
with
with.
Susan that it's not just imagination. Speculative is basically material and practical. And I also coincide, I think, with all the stories that you told us, Edson, I rescue that at the core, they were talking about other possible past, other possible futures, the relationship with the other. And I'm very much sitting in that space. My work is basically designing games to talk about ethics of innovation in telecommunications. So I want to move from the idea of ethics as a ticking box document or as a committee, and I actually do more contextual, playful, and collaborative ethics that are basically speculative ethics. So in Europe, that looks like me sitting with top people from Vodafone to Airbus to Ethernet and to fire brigade, ambulance working, and people that have been affected by disaster, flood, pandemic, etc., and to play games. And in these games, they have opportunities to rehearse different futures. But I also doing work in, for example, in Indonesia, when we create or design encounters from indigenous peoples to inform emergency plans or emergency preparedness that are ruled or shaped or designed by their own epistemology, by their own conception of the world. And that is tapping again on what Edson was saying. Is my work is all as well in tapping into this performative rehearsing futures, but I will call it spaces in which others encounter. And I think this is it. For me, this is where this this is the hope that we have. That's why speculation is quite hopeful, because it's about what about if things were different, and what about if we bring the people that is actually capable of make the difference together and make them speak, even if they are from different worlds.
Yeah. I'm interested in the sort of generative, the making, the acting, the fictional performance of the future. I guess I think I'll come to Edson and then Susan to sort of see different perspectives perhaps. I guess, Edson, do you see your creative practice as a process, of an ongoing formation of an imaginary or a space of change? Is that why you would do rehearsals? Is that why you would experiment with different scripts or technology?
There's slightly different concerns and similar ones, I guess, that there are elements of technology that, in terms of creating an immersive experience, you think, what creates a sort of a magic factor? What brings you close to what you're trying to depict in the consciousness? But the best creative technologists will say, look, don't use augmented reality if this little trick here or illusion will do. On the other hand, so it's really about what fits and what is suggestive of what it is I'm trying to suggest. But on the other hand, aspects of The Last Blue Song, which we haven't entirely had time to play, what happened really is that I found that I got more and more drawn into the questions around the backstory. So when you initially suggested, that's how, in a sense, it becomes inevitably collaborative. When you initially have an idea, it's a theatre play and it's this. And then everyone kept saying to me, but what about the colony that your character's from? What about the backstory? And I had all of this in my head. And then gradually you start finding that it's impossible to tell one story without another story. And so your world and even the ethical framework in the world of technology in which it lands begins to develop in ways and in directions that I hadn't initially imagined or really hadn't given strength to, and then they start to grow even further. And with that, of course, then people find their spaces and their places and their conversations. So one of my great collaborators is from Venezuela, Alejandro Pedron. Hey, he's a mutual friend of ours. And I guess Alejandro has seen much of his own interests and concerns and passions within that too. But things happen so one of the things that came up, I guess, is this whole idea of who has the right to another's body. And so we've got this discourse around don't touch my hair. And underlying that really is this idea of the appropriation of Black bodies as objects to be touched and to be exoticized and so on. So in the rehearsal for the last Blue Song, in the sort of immersive performance piece that we put together just to kind of mark the end of the residency, but there's a moment when Femi encounters Maya, and it's directed by my friend Nick Young. And Maya and Femi, this alien, wanders around Maya, and she's drawn to her hair and just touches her hair as if to examine, its texture. And so after the performance, I did a Q&A, and a couple of friends of mine, Black women, said that they found that moment incredibly powerful because they had seen in that moment a reversal of a dynamic which they had experienced so often. It opened up a whole different way of seeing. And so actually, yes, I'd kind of created a scenario, but the ramifications of that were much bigger than I realized at that time. And so in a sense, there are different kinds of explorations, the technological, but also the kind of the ethical that comes with it. And also, I guess, one of the things which we've been talking around, the material and the real, I guess there are things in the last Blue Song that are more around investigating what it is that, what is it that we gain and lose through technology, or what can be supported and what is discouraged or limited. And so in a way, ritual is an important part of my concerns within the last Blue Song. How do we lose a sense of ritual? How is collective ritual so vital to us? And when we don't have a sense of collective ritual, we start creating them, whether it's a Trump rally or so on. Because it's also about bodies being together in space, an immersive moment, a moment of collective experience. So, in a sense, the kind of replaying or reshaping of the last Blue Song is also about thinking through these rituals. What would they be, and where would they arise from? Because we're talking about journeys of societies, but really it's about syncretism. What would be a ritual that makes sense to Britain today? That would be a public ritual that, not with a colonial past, but actually as a modern country. What would be a ritual? What would it look like?
Clap. I think there are rituals every day, and especially in this moment of pandemia, it's been sorted by rituals. We put the mask, we stay apart, we stay at home, fight invisible enemy. It's all rehearsed through rituals. Sorry.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
This is the whole point. That's what we're here. Yeah, this is really interesting. This is sort of what I was going to touch on later, but I think I want to ask Susan whether she sympathizes with this idea of the future as if we can, affect a performance, a kind of living fiction of a scenario, a future.
Sorry, I kind of the sound dipped out. Can you just ask your question again?
Sorry. I wondered how far you can sympathize with this idea of a performance of a future, a creative practice of a future within your work at the Digital Futures Institute.
Well, I mean, that's a so many answers to that question. It's hard to think which way in. I thought you were going to ask me about speculation, but let's think about performance. And I suppose performance is speculative, given that we don't know what futures are going to be. So I think any performance relating to the future is speculative. I'm very strongly, I mean, so from the Digital Futures Institute point of view, two key things. Speculation is key and performance is key. And I would go beyond performance and say that there's an emphasis on performativity. So not just performing something, but also how the performance of something can contribute to the creation of something. So, yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in what Edson and I say and agree. You know, it's not controversial to me, the idea that we might want to perform and try and test and speculate about futures, both individually, collectively, materially and culturally. As part of the Digital Futures Institute, we're experimenting with a whole load of different methods for doing that, and one of that does involve immersive experiences and the creation of multiple alternative futures that can be experienced collectively, not in a kind of headset-y sort of individualized way, but in a collective and interactive way. And that's not time to go into all of that or what we're doing with it, but one iteration of that is that we can work with participatory speculative futures in creating multiple alternative futures that you know, not the usual suspects, you know, not your Elon Musk or whoever it is who's used to talking about and creating the future, but with people who have very different ideas about what futures might be, what futures could or should be, and what that might feel like, and to use that not as a predictive tool, but as a provocative tool, as a way of thinking about both dystopian and utopian visions of the future, what we would have to do in order to get where we want to go and to avoid the things we don't want to do. And I think, you know, when you're talking, Edson, that's so, and I think when you weren't in the room, we were talking about the ways in which past and presents are linked to the future. And I think that's so resonant in what you're talking about, is the relationship between past, present and future, and that speculative performance as a way of integrating those things quite explicitly and kind of lifting them to the surface so we can talk about them in ways that we're not used to talking about them. And if we can do that, then perhaps we can think about how we integrate them in the creation of technologies. And that goes to your point, Maria, about how can we be in and against the digital age, if you like. You know, we can't absent ourselves from it, most of us at least, but, you know, we can try to shape it and create it and to resist and direct and do those kinds of things. I'll stop talking now. But yeah, so I think I'm saying yes to everybody.
I think I really like your point on speculation. I found that I will define it as a tool to open for discussions. I wanted to rescue that point because I really identified it with it. Rather than presenting my own perfect idea of future, which I think is very sterile, because whose idea, whose future? Use it to open spaces for discussions or make tangible what otherwise would be very difficult to access. So I found speculation as a key. But Susan, I'm super excited to get to know you because I totally have to visit the Institute virtually or presential or something, because you're talking amazing things.
Thank you, and likewise also with you, with Edson as well. I think there's so many points of connection here. So thank you, Maria, for putting us all in a room together.
I think
You,
so. I was just responding to something that Susan said as well. That we talked about which I missed. Conversation between past and present and future. I guess just to add, I think one of my frustrations and concerns are that I've been witness to and experienced the, you know, 2 generations worth of different kinds of Black struggle or activist struggle, and also being involved in LGBT struggles and campaigns and so on. And I suspect that having lived through the 80s, I don't really feel the internet has done more than just intensify the sort of factionalism that has sometimes been part of discourse on the left. But I'm aware that sometimes activist movements can sometimes flounder because of a lack of clarity of vision. What is the vision that we're trying to achieve and reach? And I guess when I'm looking at the various threads to my inspiration, I reminded of some of the issues that came up with South African novelists. How much do you write towards the struggle, and how much do you also entertain the idea of the free imagination, or is writing just literally a servant of political struggle? And the downside, I guess, of the immediate application of the conversation on political struggle is that one is so tied up with it, you're never quite sure what we're moving towards. We never have time to really thoroughly investigate the kind of what is this world that we're looking at, to sort of think it through actually ethically, and thinking of the revolutions that we've seen, or in a sense how they've turned sour, both historically and contemporaneously. I think it's partly because we have not had the space to investigate what it is we're looking to recreate, what it is we want to see in the future, as opposed to being so concerned with the struggle. So that those forces then shape the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I really, really agree with that. I mean, I could say a lot about the internet. Maybe I shouldn't, but I think that's right. That this, this idea of utopia as method. I mean, I find the concept of utopia problematic for various reasons. But this idea of, kind of really imagining where do we want to get to, and allowing a speculative way of thinking about that. Not whether it's realistic or not. Let's just think, where do we really want to get to? But then think, what would we have to do in order to get there?
Yes.
That kind of really systematic working through. Now, that's where it's not just the imaginary, because the imaginary is great, but you've got to have the means, you've got to have the tactics and the tools and the strategies to get there. And so I think that's a very powerful way of thinking. I won't go on about the internet now, but...
No, I mean, I completely connected what you're saying. I was lucky enough to get a bursary to go to Chicago last year, Festival of Ideas and British Council. And one of the exhibitions I encountered was around, it was around future technologies, basically, and that's kind of crudely put it. But it was a lot of the things I was sort of thinking through with the last Blue song is, how much do I want it to be sort of sci-fi fantasy? How much is it really about something that's real and that could be processually proven or evidenced? And I guess even ideas of vertical farming and ways in which we can do agriculture differently, technologies that are actually in existence now, and then it gives you a kind of a route to, as you say, not in a sense just be imagining these utopian futures, but to say, look, we have these technologies currently present, but we are not using them to their full effectiveness. Our energies are not in that direction. Yeah. And yet, if they were in that direction,
There's always choices about what technologies are used. What's the problem? What are we directing the effort towards? And by implication, what are we not directing the effort towards? What's included? What's excluded? And I think that's absolutely critical. And I'd go one step further than that. It is absolutely exactly as you say about thinking about, technologies are quite malleable. They can do different kinds of things, I mean, there's applications of quite basic science, and they can go in a whole variety of directions. And the question is, what directions are, make money or are regulated by governments or whatever. There's questions of power. All comes back to questions of power, because it always does.
Yeah.
But I'd go even one step further than that, which is, how are technologies of the future being created now? So, as a non-engineer, I'm just about up to, I think, 5G or something is really now. It's really, we need to be thinking about what are we using 5G for. I can tell you, absolutely that engineers are working on what comes after 5G. They're working on quantum computing. They're working on whatever it is. And what we need to be doing is finding, that goes back to that staying with the troubles thing, which is, how do we find ways of working together with those forms of expertise? I mean, maybe not in all of industry wants to do that, but there's large bits of academic research that wants.
But I will contest that.
I think industry does as well.
Yeah, I think there is a tendency of demonize industry and big tech. And actually, I found in my practice that they're desperate to hear other point of view, to making good technology. And in my practice, I receive calls all the time for more training, for more ethical assessment. And I think they're willing to open. They think there is a motorway laid down for them to go full speed. But we can get in there as well. We just have to make spaces for it. So I'm very hopeful. I don't know if it's naivety. But I believe
But
that we can make other words within this word.
do you find in your experience that when you have these conversations about ethics, does it end with the buck?
Does it end with what?
The buck. Because
What
I
do you mean
guess,
by the buck?
well, does money, so in a sense, oh gosh, does money limit, does it create limitations on on how far they take seriously an ethical consideration?
I think there is a merging of ethical, regulation, and moral. So they're not all equal. And regulation goes very, very, very slow. And it's actually making obstacles for innovation. And moral is contextual. And it's always to do with power relationships. Well, the way I'm seeing ethics is to do it contextual and collaboratively, is a way that doesn't require any money or any extra creativity, or doesn't stop innovation but actually drive it. So no, I don't.
I suppose maybe if I'm being a little bit crude, I mean, Susan, you used the analogy of they're already working on 6G or 7G. Sometimes in that work, the implications of what that technology can do in terms of harvesting data and information and so on may not be fully understood at the time, or maybe it is. So my question would be then is, can you be in the room at the point of the innovation to actually start asking questions before it's out in the public domain?
That's
actually my work. I actually work with 5G for emergency response, and I was in the room on Monday afternoon. So I think actually there are a lot of spaces for intervening, and I don't see these big companies and these people as a monster sitting in a big building saying, whoa. I actually, there are consortia full of academics, and especially Europe has about 5 or 7 years working with ELSI at the center of all innovation projects, and LCS, ethical, social, and legal implications. So they have to have that package within the project. So I think some of us are sitting in these rooms, Edson. There is hope.
Good.
I want to get back to how we can start making new realities, making new technologies that reflect diverse imaginations. I guess for anyone, my questions will be, can the speculative imagining the possible be accepted firstly as a form of knowledge within academia, and then sort of perhaps touching on Marley's process, how can you create a kind of pedagogy that uses the imagination as a central tool? If you're doing that right now, or if you're trying to sort of, break down the separate disciplines that make up, silos of innovation, will imagining the impossible sort of ever become a form of knowledge?
But this is my humble job at the moment. I work at the center and we teach different disciplines in one classroom. We teach 14 different disciplines. And at the moment, I'm designing a pedagogy for responsible research innovation, not just to train students to innovate responsible, but also colleagues and people like in AA or in different industries that are rehearsing those futures. And my idea of responsibility is not just a duty, or we have to do this as a form of justice or as a form of gender or as a form of this, because as you say, we don't have the knowledge. We don't have the full picture of what's coming in front. So my idea of responsibility is create spaces and capabilities to include responses of our designers in the world, but responses of others and responses of people that are affected by it. So by designing the spaces within the innovation or the product or the system, it's the only way that we can ensure that we stay.
Now, I guess throughout this discussion, speculation and imagination is, no longer seen as a private exercise, and the demands on the future are greatly, expanded and uncovered when we do speculate, when we do encourage thinking from, all sorts of places, positions. It is a social practice. It both shapes and is shaped by, the landscape of technology and scientific knowledge, of which, a person who imagines is a part. I guess, Susan, how would you suggest we keep speculative, keep recognizing techno-futures as malleable when, it's perhaps demanded of us within certain structures or institutions to, fill out a research proposal and know by the end of the research proposal what it is we're going to find out?
Well, it depends what question, isn't it? I mean, if you want to ask about futures in the making, then that's a great research question, I'd say. How are futures made? Who's making futures? What are the trajectories? What are the investments? What are the imaginaries that are at play? How do they operate in different fields of social life? How are they shaping the way that we learn, that we consume, that we move, that we organize, that we, all of the things that we do as human beings? So, I mean, I don't see that it's a problem for asking research questions, because what's more important than the future? I mean, it's where we go. I don't see that as a problem, and I think we can keep the speculative very much alive because of the way that I was talking right at the beginning, which is that we don't know for sure what the future is. So it's always speculative in that sense. So I'm very optimistic about that. Your question was about imagining the impossible. I mean, I think the impossible is a provocation, but I also think I'd question, how do we know what's impossible? There's possibilities, right? And there's many things that have happened that 50 years ago would have been seen to be impossible. 20 years ago, last year, it may have seemed to be impossible that we'd all be living these lives according to habits and routines that Marne was talking about. So I don't, I would personally avoid this kind of possible, impossible juxtaposition. I'm not sure it's very helpful.
I will say reworking impossibilities, current impossibilities, making it work.
Yeah. So it's a provocation, and it's a provocation both in terms of where you want to get to and how you would get there, which is your making it work bit, Marley, I think. Yeah. So you ask, is the impossible, can the impossible be a form of knowledge? And I think that's a much longer conversation about what we mean by knowledge and what counts and who gets to say and when and why and all of those kinds of things. But I certainly think there's a great deal of interest. I think there has never been, in my experience, more interest in seriously engaging with futures, particularly with regard to digital technologies and to technology more generally. That, of course, technology is not, because of my position on this, which is that technology is inherently social and the social is now inherently digital or technological, that brings with it all of the power relations and inequalities and questions of politics and economics and all the rest of it. But, I've never known a time where there was more willingness to engage proactively, directly and seriously with futures thinking than there is now.
Is this reflective of your experience, Edson? I mean, would you like to see kind of underpinnings of your own Afrofuturism sort of brought into the main, or do you see it being engaged with, sitting alongside ethics, sustainability, for example? Is sort of a techno-future, it's your techno-futures through your creative practice. Have you seen an engagement with it in broader sort of overarching structures?
I think to answer the question slightly differently, I guess my interest is in around the integration of new technologies with old perceptions, at the same time with the recovery and excavation of other kinds of perceptions that have been erased. And I suppose one of my concerns is that modernity was predicated on a vision of Europe. And so the new countries, new peoples that were created by the empires or empires very much took their economic and social and political models from elsewhere. And because, in a sense, the pace of technological investigation, because the future is now the present, it is happening, and vice versa. Because of the pace of this, the possibility of really interrogating what future we want, as people who are in the process of talking about decolonization, it feels to me that that's not quite being heard. Those discourses are not matching up. And so in the end, I mean, I'll just take, for example, I've my Netflix subscription and seeing filmmaking from across the world, and with Netflix budgets and Netflix South African version and Nigerian version and so on. But there's a blueprint there in filmmaking and blueprint in storytelling and a kind of look in technology. And that says more about a US film industry than it does around the possibilities of storytelling that were grown locally. Storytelling traditions that have a different aesthetic, a different trajectory, and different character concerns and so on. So in a sense, yes, you've got a new industry starting up. You've got this dissemination of possibilities of the imagination, but actually that imagination is already going down a familiar route of the invention of modernity as being predicated on the West. So my interest isn't so much just in the technology, but actually in what are the possibilities of a reconnection. And we see this to some extent with the conversations around decolonization that you're seeing in the African continent, in the US, and in Britain. But actually, the interesting thing is I'm not quite sure in that discourse as to what decolonization really looks like. And I say that because for me, my experience of just beginning to see something of the different conceptual concerns and philosophical concerns and ethics of societies pre-Europe, decolonization as it's currently understood doesn't involve that incorporation. It's more of, I think, of a way of, I'm not sure what it is really, and that sounds, I don't mean to sound glib, but it has to, I think, what this new curriculum looks like, or new ways of thinking looks like, I can't see how it's really going to shift anything forward if we don't really also do some excavation work. The colonial moment is such a powerful one in how it still echoes and shapes the consciousness of new peoples. And I say new peoples because they haven't connected to their old peoples. Just running out of words. Sorry.
Marlo, do you have your own thoughts about bringing the speculative into the domain of everyday innovation, the domain of everyday consuming media or understanding the future, or do you think speculation is actually in the main, obviously in your case in the academia world?
Yeah, I'm more hopeful because I don't think we can erase the past. We hopefully are learning in the hard way from the past, and the revolution is step by step. So I'm very hopeful this year. I love all the Black Lives Matter movement, but I also think there are other epistemological voices coming up, not just in academia, but in other circles. But in a parenthesis, I just want to say that I stopped seeing you I have a big notice from the hoping platform saying that it's gonna kick me out, and I don't know how to get rid of
Oh,
that. Yeah,
we
so
can
I'm
still see
talking to a
you.
black screen, and that makes things very weird now. But yeah, I don't know how to sort that. Can you still see
Cool.
me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
I think we should try and try and wrap it up. In a, I think I'd quite like to ask Susan, how these ideas from creative practice, from speculative innovation, collaboration, how can these ideas, form a runway to creating, new technologies? Do you have a sort of practical idea of how using those ideas can really start to tear up the fabric of things?
I was with you till, I mean, I'm not sure they're going to tear up the fabric immediately. They might make a few little holes in it. But so for me, it would be linking speculative methods with participatory practice and co-design and co-production. So if we're serious about engaging beyond the usual suspects in the question of technology creation, then we have to find methods that enable that meaningful engagement that is not simply on the terms of the established path for technological discussions, but widens out radically beyond that to allow very different starting points, very different kinds of imaginaries and conversations. And we need to harness the creative, we need to harness narratology and film and immersive experience and all the methods we might possibly have at our disposal in order to let that speculative imagination flower and bloom and become a loud voice that can then be integrated as part of the process of technical creation or digital creation. And that's part of what we're doing with Digital Futures is we have those alliances already set in place between the engineers and the social scientists and the creative people, industry, government, civic groups. And so it's speculation for participation and creation is what I would say.
Excellent. I believe you have to go.
I do.
So you may leave, but thank you so much for joining in this conversation. I think it feels like it's the start of a kind of patchwork of the future.
Thank you for organising, Maria. I'm sorry I have to go. I do. And lovely to meet you, Edson, and hopefully we'll all keep in touch.
Will do. Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Edson, are you staying on for one more question?
Oh, okay, yeah.
I guess, do you have a kind of call to action yourself? How can we do more speculative dreaming?
My call to action would be to ask ourselves and to spend some time reflecting on the futures that we want and the paths we want to take to get there. And I would say, with perhaps thinking of the futures that we want, that it's perhaps good to use the old exercise of 5, 10, 15, 50 years beyond one's lifetime, and maybe to keep the long view of the future firmly in mind. I say that because I guess we can rail against the machine, and that, in a sense, it can be a goal. But I'm thinking more in terms of what does the world look like if we imagine we have agency to do more than just rail, but also to shape. So I think this blue sky thinking is called that, but actually I think it's very much part of the construction of the goals that we have in life, in our present. Gives us an orientation point and helps us decide judiciously between actions we want to take and others that we might not take, and also actually actions that we might think differently about in a broader context of what they can achieve.
Excellent. Thank you. We have lost Marley. She's been kicked out. But
Yeah.
I think really we've sort of hit many, nails on the head. And I did ask if you wish to read anything to leave us with, but you don't have to. I just thought that might be, that would get us going.
I have got something.
Cool.
And if you just bear with me one moment, I will find it. So this is the nice thing about finally sorting out my study. I say it's a study, it's like a little cell. But it does mean that things should be closer to hand than they normally are.
Don't worry if you cannot find it.
Well, it's not too far. It's just my eyesight. And how are you keeping? Have you enjoyed? What have you learned from this talk? Can I ask?
Oh, to keep going, to keep really sort of thinking generatively, I guess. Making sure that other people meet each other from different disciplines, and hopefully coming to a conclusion, and then act as a kind of springboard for the next event, the next conversation, next year's Bristol Technology Festival.
Right.
Do you have what you're going to read?
Yes, I do.
Cool.
So this is an extract from a poem called Come. But this is an extract. Flux and fever-ridden, startled, blinking, bile-caked, beaten by sun gloating, black flower embossed upon charred tree, bitter-sweet birthing of black child, vexed head emerging, shade in prayer, flight in dance, abrupt ending. Whip outrunning oceans and striving, England yearning, turning to fury spiraling, capsizing into glory, found in guns and gold, emblem encased epic, street killing. I am encircled by ancestors, living and departed, chanting, circling, pressing. I open every pore to imbibe their sorrow wisdom, ruinous secrets, scraps of melody, frayed lexicons, grasped scraps of motherland, ballast, seed, and sand, cells to knowing, last cries, lost rights. I take my place amongst the circle, become part of their continuum.
Excellent. Thank you. This has been an event hosted by Invented Futures. You can find us at inventedfutures.co.uk and on Twitter, Invented Futures. And we've been joined by Edson Burton, Male Lujan Escalante, and Susan Halford. Keep speculating, keep futuring, and keep creating.